Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Friday, June 20th, 2025. This is USA Today's The Excerpt. Today, when might we get a decision on the U.S. approach to Iran and Israel? Plus how Trump's National Guard immigration enforcement could divide states, and it's been 50 years since the release of Jaws. President Donald Trump will decide in the next 2 weeks whether the U.S. will get involved in the conflict between Israel and Iran. That's what the White House said yesterday. Trump continues to keep the world guessing on his plans. He had proposed a diplomatic solution, but has also suggested the U.S. might join the fighting on Israel's side. Iran has said it won't negotiate under duress. The conflict has killed at least 240 Iranians and 24 Israelis in a week. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt declined to say if Trump would seek congressional authorization for strikes on Iran. The possibility of the Trump administration sending National Guard troops on immigration raids outside their own state could cause a legal clash between states and with the federal government. I spoke with USA Today White House reporter Davis Winke for more. Davis, thanks for joining me today.
It's good to be back.
So Davis, starting here, the Pentagon is weighing a request from the Department of Homeland Security to call up members of the National Guard under state authority. What did you find taking a closer look at this memo?
The way that the administration wants to bring the National Guard into immigration enforcement really diverges from the ways in which the National Guard has previously been used on this front. There have been border efforts that have really sparked professionalization and even reforms of the National Guard when necessary. But each of those missions, to include ones under Obama, Biden, and Trump, were focused on border security rather than interior immigration enforcement. And that's what stands out, is that now the Trump administration wants 20,000 guardsmen to participate in interior immigration enforcement rather than just border security as they have in the past.
Well, putting just slightly a tighter lens here, Davis, what is the 287G program and how would it be used here?
It's named after a section in the federal law that authorizes a lot of immigration enforcement. It's a vehicle by which local and state law enforcement agencies can enter formal partnerships with ICE and DHS. One of the ways in which this can be done is by serving warrants or by doing jailhouse cooperation, where if somebody that a local sheriff's office brings in, for example, has an ICE detainer, then they will coordinate with ICE to give that person over to them when it's appropriate to do so. But the Trump administration has revived a old version of 287G called the task force model that actually involves taking law enforcement officers from local and now even state agencies and deputizing them with immigration enforcement powers that lets them go forth and detain people on suspicion of not being lawfully in the United States, for example. What it also does is it allows these individuals from participating agencies to go out and about as part of ICE-led task forces or other federal law enforcement task forces that seek to enforce immigration laws. It's basically a way for the immigration enforcement apparatus to widen its reach around the country.
Well, I know a big question here is what this means for crossing state lines, right, and the differences from one state to the next. Can task force participants under 287G operate across state lines?
Well, Taylor, that's the big question, and it's one that, according to CNN, officials in the administration, in DHS, and in the Pentagon are asking. The reason why the administration is likely exploring this possibility is that National Guard troops under state authority are not subject to the restrictions of the Posse Comitatus Act, which is a law that forbids active duty U.S. military personnel from directly enforcing civilian laws. That's a law that has limited exceptions, but the biggest one is those Guard troops on state duty can enforce laws. And by bringing Guard troops on state duty onto immigration task forces, you've theoretically then expanded those task forces with a lot more manpower. But the question remains, can those troops go across state lines? The experts that I talked to for this story, Taylor, just don't know.
And as you outline in this piece, Davis, this could potentially mean just broader clashes, right, between red states and blue states. Is that a fair way to look at this?
I think so. There's been in recent years a increasing pattern of clashes between states and the federal government over control and use of the National Guard. The modern examples start with more recently in the first Trump administration when the news of family separations came to light. A lot of Democratic governors withdrew their consent for their personnel who were on state duty at the border under a federally organized task force. So there have been concepts like this before that haven't been doing direct interior immigration enforcement that have had political issues rend the working relationships there. You also saw during the COVID pandemic some red state governors fight against the Biden administration trying to mandate the COVID-19 vaccine for troops in their National Guard. And then what we're seeing right now out in California with the administration federalizing the 4,000 members of the California National Guard against the consent of Governor Gavin Newsom out there. It's a different legal authority than the one that would be in play for the DHS request. But it just goes to show that there are a lot of traditional limits and boundaries with this relationship over the guard between states and the federal government that's taken it from a largely cooperative one in the modern era to one where now you've got people looking to score political points on each other.
All right, another great piece from you, Davis. Folks can find the full version with the link in today's show notes. Davis Winkie covers the White House for USA Today. Thank you, Davis.
Thanks for having me.
A U.S. appeals court let President Trump retain control yesterday of California's National Guard, while the state's Democratic governor proceeds with a lawsuit challenging Trump's use of the troops amid protests and riots in Los Angeles. Meanwhile, the Los Angeles Dodgers said yesterday that immigration and customs enforcement agents were denied entry to the stadium grounds, while ICE says the agency was never there, and the Department of Homeland Security claims the masked agents were with Customs and Border Patrol. You can read more about that with a link in today's show notes. President Trump has again extended the deadline for a TikTok ban to go into effect, allowing the Chinese-owned social media platform to continue operating for the next 90 days. Trump had said earlier in the week that he planned to give TikTok a third extension and signed an executive order yesterday making it official. It was the third time that Trump authorized a delay. The social media app's parent company, ByteDance, now has until September 17th to secure a deal that satisfies a legal requirement. Lawmakers ordered TikTok to divest from its Chinese ownership or face a ban in the United States over national security concerns. Former President Joe Biden signed the bipartisan legislation into law, and the Supreme Court held the ban. But since returning to office, Trump has directed the Department of Justice not to enforce it. It's been 50 years since an iconic movie and theme song kept beachgoers out of the water for a summer and even longer. I spoke with USA Today national correspondent Marco Della Cava on the anniversary of Jaws. Marco, I always appreciate you stopping by. How are you today?
I am great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for hopping on. Really fun story. I cannot believe it's the 50th anniversary of Jaws. So let's just first go back to 1975. How big of a phenomenon was Jaws that summer?
One way to answer that is one of the gentlemen I interviewed said he finally got to see it in 1979 because he was old enough 4 years later, and the line was still around the block in 1979. So you can imagine 1975.
Wow. And I know, you hear stories about folks not wanting to go into the water for that entire summer, in some cases, years, in some cases, an entire lifetime, right, Marco, after seeing this movie. How badly did it scare people?
Yeah, I mean, it terrified folks young and old, and I was happy to learn interviewing people that I was not alone in not wanting to go in the water and being very scared for years. In fact, I was even scared of going into a pool. So, and apparently that phenomenon affected other people as well. As crazy as it sounds, there's no sharks in pools, but any kind of situation where you're in water and you're not sure what's out there, your mind can get ahead of yourself quickly. And Spielberg did an amazing job because, as you remember in the opening scene in the first shark attack, you don't see a shark. And that sort of stayed with people that here I am bobbing in the water, and yet who knows what's beneath me.
Well, you mentioned Spielberg. He went on to have this massive career, but this was early on in his career. And you write that Jaws was both his origin story and almost his career killer. How so?
Absolutely. He was under pressure to deliver a blockbuster, ideally under budget. This was a very, very popular novel at the time, and they wanted it out for summer, and he was having massive problems with the mechanical shark. Obviously, he had insisted on shooting it, as you know, in Martha's Vineyard, and also with a real mechanical shark out in the ocean, and that caused all sorts of problems that he felt were just going to be his undoing. He felt he might get kicked off the project. And in the end, of course, it was, as he said in a documentary I watched, the movie that gave him final cut for the rest of his life. So it made him in a huge way.
So, many of the iconic scenes were filmed off the coast of Massachusetts around the island of Martha's Vineyard, a place I know well and have spent a lot of time. And, most Jaws cast members were locals from the island, Marco. Tell us about some of these folks and also their memories from the Jaws production.
Yeah, that's quite the amazing thing. They came to Martha's Vineyard with, I think it was 8 professional actors, and everyone else was cast locally. And that is what gives the movie its real genuine flavor. And a lot of these folks have since turned up at Jaws festivals that are happening. Different years they've happened, but they're going to happen this summer at the 50th anniversary on Martha's Vineyard. And those who are still alive, who are probably in their 20s, I think the gentleman who plays the college kid at the opening scene, he's often spotted talking to Jaws fans on the island. So that's a big part of the success of the movie was the fact that it felt real because it really kind of was real in many ways.
Yeah, and Martha's Vineyard local Jeff Voorhees played one of the Jaws victims as a kid. He spoke to the Cape Cod Times, part of the USA Today network. Let's hear what he had to say.
The third victim to get eaten by the shark in that movie back 50 years ago. Day 2, we tried, your leg came out of the water. Day 3, your arm came out of the water. And then day 5, Spielberg finally goes, this is taking too long. He goes, this time we got a different plan. He goes, we got 2 guys in wetsuits. They're going to be underwater. When that thing explodes, each one's going to grab one of your legs, lift you in and out of the water a few times, and then pull you under and give you air.
Yeah, well, it's the 50th anniversary this summer. How are fans, how are former, you mentioned part of this, but former cast members and members of this production marking the 50th anniversary?
In terms of how the cast is marking it, it's a good question. I mean, Richard Dreyfuss famously doesn't like talking about Jaws. Spielberg rarely talks about Jaws. It was a long time ago, but I think it's mostly the fans, young and old, and therefore you're going to see Jaws on television quite often over the next few months. There's going to be a re-release of the actual movie, I believe, in August. And there are lots of documentaries as well coming out. So anyone who likes the movie is going to be able to learn a lot more about it.
And Mark, are you still staying away from the ocean all these years after seeing Jaws?
I don't stay away from it, but as one of the people I interviewed said, I don't turn my back to the horizon.
Fair enough. Marco Della Cava is a national correspondent with USA Today, joining us here on the 50th anniversary of Jaws. Thanks, Marco.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Excerpt. We're produced by Shannon Ray Green and Kelly Monahan, and our executive producer is Laura Beatty. You can get the podcast wherever you get your audio, and if you're on a smart speaker, just ask for The Excerpt. As always, you can email us at podcasts@usatoday.com. I'm Taylor Wilson, and I'll be back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.